Hey everyone! Welcome to our very first episode of Thinking in English, a journey of the mind. I'm Sarah, and with me, as always, is my great friend, Alex.
Hi, everyone. We're really excited to dive into today's topic because it's something both of us have grappled with for a long time. We're talking about how to start thinking in English. It's such a fascinating journey, and we're here to share our experiences and tips that have worked for us.
Absolutely. You know, Alex, thinking in a language that isn't your mother tongue can be really challenging at first. It's like rewiring your brain to process thoughts differently. But once you get the hang of it, it's incredibly empowering.
Oh, for sure. I remember when I first started learning English, I was always translating everything in my head. It was exhausting, to be honest. It felt like my brain was running a marathon every time I tried to have a conversation.
I know exactly what you mean. It's like your brain is working overtime to find the right words in your native language and then translate them into English. And then, by the time you've done that, the conversation has moved on.
Right? It's frustrating. But I think that's a natural phase. It's part of the process. And it's important to realize that it's okay to struggle with it at first. But the key is to move beyond that translation stage and start thinking directly in English.
That's such a good point. It's like learning to ride a bike. At first, you need the training wheels, but once you start balancing on your own, you can go much faster and smoother. So, Alex, how did you start thinking in English? What was your turning point?
I'd say the turning point for me was when I started immersing myself more in English. I'm talking about everyday situations where I forced myself to think in English, even when I was alone. For example, when I was making breakfast, I'd describe to myself in English what I was doing. I'm cracking the eggs, I'm toasting the bread. It sounds silly, but it really helped.
That's a great strategy. I did something similar, actually. I'd go on walks and just narrate everything around me in English. Like, the sky is cloudy today. Or, I see a dog running. It might feel awkward at first, but it really trains your brain to switch to English mode naturally.
Exactly. It's like you're creating an English speaking environment in your own mind. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles, creating that environment, especially if you don't live in a place where English is the dominant language.
Yeah, it's all about building that environment internally. Another thing that worked for me was talking to myself in English. I know that sounds weird, but it was really effective. I'd have mini conversations with myself about anything, how my day was going, what I plan to do next, or even just random thoughts.
I love that. It's like you're becoming your own language partner. Plus, it's a judgment free zone because it's just you, right?
Exactly. And the more I did it, the more natural it felt. After a while, I didn't have to consciously switch to English. It just started happening automatically. It's like my brain got used to thinking in English without needing that extra push.
That's so true. It's all about consistency too. The more you practice, the less you'll need to think about it. But I also found that it helped to focus on topics I was passionate about. For example, I love cooking, so I'd think about recipes, ingredients, and cooking techniques in English. It made the process more enjoyable because I was thinking about something I genuinely cared about.
That's a fantastic tip. When you're interested in a subject, you're naturally more motivated to think about it, and it doesn't feel like a chore. Plus, you're building vocabulary in areas that are meaningful to you, which is a bonus.
Totally. And speaking of vocabulary, another thing that helped me was simplifying my thoughts at first. Instead of trying to form complex sentences in English, I'd start with the basics, short, simple sentences. Then, as I got more comfortable, I'd gradually build up to more complex thoughts.
That's a smart approach. It's like laying a foundation and then adding layers to it. If you try to do too much too soon, it can be overwhelming. But if you start simple, you're giving yourself a solid base to build on.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to be patient with yourself. This isn't something that happens overnight, it takes time. And there will be days when you feel like you're not making any progress. But the key is to keep going and not get discouraged.
Patience is definitely key. It's easy to get frustrated, especially when you're not seeing immediate results. But every little bit of practice adds up. even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. And it's also important to celebrate the small victories, like the first time you catch yourself thinking in English without even realizing it.
Yes, those moments are so rewarding. They're proof that all your hard work is paying off. And I think those small victories help keep you motivated to continue.
Definitely. So, let's recap some of the key strategies we've talked about for starting to think in English. First, immerse yourself in English as much as possible, even in everyday situations.
Right, and talk to yourself in English. It's a great way to practice without any pressure.
Simplify your thoughts at first and gradually build up to more complex sentences as you get more comfortable.
And be patient with yourself. It's a journey and it takes time, but every bit of practice brings you closer to your goal.
Exactly. And remember to focus on topics that interest you. It makes the process more enjoyable and helps you stay motivated.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We hope you found those initial tips useful. But, Sarah, I think there's so much more we can dive into on this topic. It's not just about the mechanics of thinking in English, it's also about mindset, right?
Oh, absolutely. Mindset plays a huge role in this journey. One of the biggest challenges people face is the fear of making mistakes. I know I struggled with that a lot. I was always so worried about getting things wrong that I'd hesitate to even try thinking or speaking in English.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That fear can be really paralyzing. It's like you're so focused on being perfect that you forget that mistakes are part of the learning process. I had to remind myself that it's okay to make mistakes. In fact, it's necessary.
Yes, it's like we're so afraid of sounding foolish that we forget that everyone makes mistakes when learning something new. And it's not just about making mistakes, it's about learning from them. Every time you correct yourself, you're one step closer to mastering the language.
Exactly. I think it's important to reframe how we see mistakes. Instead of thinking of them as failures, we should see them as opportunities to improve. For example, if I caught myself using the wrong word or phrase, I'd make a mental note of it and try to use the correct one the next time.
That's such a positive way to approach it. And another thing that helped me was letting go of the need to translate everything perfectly. When I first started, I wanted my English thoughts to be as polished as my native language thoughts, but that's just not realistic in the beginning.
That's so true. Your thoughts don't have to be perfect. They just have to be understood, even if only by you at first. Over time, they'll become clearer and more accurate as you practice. I think that's where confidence comes in. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become in your ability to think in English.
Definitely. And confidence isn't just about believing in your abilities, it's also about trusting the process. Trust that with time and practice, your brain will adapt. It's like when you're learning to drive. At first, you're hyper aware of every move, but eventually, it becomes second nature.
Exactly. And speaking of practice, another strategy that really helped me was engaging with English content. That challenged me just a little bit. If something was too easy, I wouldn't learn much. But if it was too difficult, I'd get frustrated. So I found that sweet spot where I could understand most of what was happening, but there were still new words and concepts that pushed me to think harder.
That's a great point. It's all about finding that balance. I did something similar with reading. I started with simpler books and articles that matched my current level, and as I got more comfortable, I gradually moved on to more complex material. It was a great way to build my vocabulary and get used to different sentence structures.
Yes, reading is such a powerful tool. And I think it's also important to choose materials that interest you. If you're reading something you enjoy, you're more likely to stay engaged and less likely to get discouraged by the challenges.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to reread things. Sometimes I'd go over the same paragraph multiple times until I felt comfortable with the vocabulary and the way the sentences were structured. Each time, I'd understand a little more. And that made a big difference in how I processed information in English.
That's a really good tip. Repetition is key. The more you expose yourself to certain words and phrases, the more natural they become. It's like you're training your brain to recognize patterns in the language.
Exactly. And another thing that really helped me was using visuals. When I was learning new words, I'd often pair them with images in my mind. For example, if I was learning the word apple, I'd picture an apple in my head whenever I thought of the word. It helped me associate the word with the object directly in English without needing to translate it from my native language.
That's a great technique. Visualization can be really powerful because it helps create a direct link between the word and its meaning in your mind. It's almost like you're building a mental dictionary where the definitions are in pictures instead of words.
Exactly. And over time, as you build up that mental dictionary, it becomes easier to think in English because you're not relying on translations anymore. The words and concepts are already linked in your mind.
Yes, and that ties into another strategy I found useful, focusing on common phrases or expressions. Instead of just learning individual words, I tried to learn phrases that I could use in everyday situations. This way, I didn't have to think about constructing sentences from scratch each time. I could just pull from a mental library of ready made phrases.
That's so smart. Phrases are like shortcuts for your brain. When you know a phrase, you don't have to spend time figuring out the grammar or word order. It's already done for you. Plus, it helps with fluency because you can speak more naturally and quickly.
Exactly. And the more you use those phrases, the more ingrained they become. Over time, you start thinking in those phrases, and that's when your thoughts in English start flowing more smoothly.
Yes, and I think that's when you start to feel like you're really thinking in English rather than just translating in your head. It's a gradual process, but those moments when you catch yourself thinking in English without effort are so rewarding.
Definitely. It's those little breakthroughs that keep you motivated. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that everyone's journey is different. Some people might start thinking in English quickly, while others might take longer, and that's okay.
Absolutely. It's not a race, and there's no one size fits all approach. What's important is finding what works for you and sticking with it. The more you practice, the more progress you'll make.
Right. And it's also important to stay curious and open minded. I've found that when I approach learning with curiosity, I'm more engaged and willing to explore new things. Whether it's trying out a new word, reading a challenging article, or even just experimenting with different ways to express my thoughts. That sense of curiosity keeps the process exciting.
That's such a great attitude to have. Curiosity drives learning, and it makes the whole experience more enjoyable. And speaking of exploring new things, another tip that really helped me was listening to different accents. English is spoken all over the world, and there are so many different accents and dialects. Exposing myself to these different ways of speaking helped me become more flexible in my thinking.
That's a fantastic point. English is such a diverse language, and hearing it spoken in different accents can really broaden your understanding. It also helps you get used to the fact that there's not just one correct way to speak English. It's a global language, and it's okay if your English reflects your unique background.
Exactly. And I think that's another important mindset shift embracing your own way of speaking English. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking you need to sound like a native speaker. But the truth is, your accent and way of speaking are part of your identity. They tell your story.
That's so true. We shouldn't be afraid to let our personality and background shine through in our English. It makes our communication richer and more authentic. And in the end, language is about connection, not perfection.
Absolutely. It's about being able to express yourself and connect with others, even if your English isn't perfect. The more you focus on communication rather than perfection, the more natural your thoughts in English will become.
Yes, and I think that's a great note to wrap up on. Thinking in English is a journey, and it's all about finding what works for you, practicing consistently, and being patient with yourself. Remember, it's not about being perfect, it's about making progress. Thanks for staying with us, everyone. We're really getting into the heart of what it means to think in English, and I think it's important to talk about one more key aspect: consistency. We've touched on it a bit already, but let's dig deeper. How do you stay consistent in this journey, Sarah?
Consistency is definitely crucial, but it can also be one of the hardest things to maintain. especially when life gets busy. For me, I found that integrating English into my daily routine in small, manageable ways made a big difference. Instead of trying to set aside huge blocks of time to practice, I'd incorporate English into things I was already doing.
That's a smart approach. What kind of daily activities did you use?
A big one for me was my morning routine. I started by thinking in English as soon as I woke up. I'd plan out my day in English in my head while I was getting ready. It didn't take any extra time, but it set the tone for the day and got my brain working in English right from the start.
That's a great idea. I did something similar during my commute. I'd use that time to think about what I needed to do that day, or reflect on things that had happened, all in English. It's like you're training your brain to automatically switch to English mode during specific parts of your day.
Exactly. And it becomes a habit. Another thing that helped was setting little goals for myself. For example, I'd challenge myself to think in English for a certain amount of time each day, like 10 minutes at first, then gradually increasing it. It was a way to push myself without feeling overwhelmed.
I love that. Setting small, achievable goals is so important because it gives you something concrete to work towards. And when you reach those goals, it feels really rewarding, which keeps you motivated to continue.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to mix things up, too. If you do the same thing every day, it can start to feel monotonous. So I'd vary my activities. One day, I'd focus on thinking in English while reading. Another day, I'd do it while cooking, and so on. It kept things fresh and made sure I was engaging different parts of my brain.
That's a great way to keep the process dynamic. Variety is key, especially when you're trying to stay consistent over the long term. And speaking of variety, I think another important factor is finding ways to make English fun. It shouldn't feel like a chore.
Exactly. Fun is such an underrated aspect of learning. When you're enjoying yourself, you're much more likely to stick with it. I remember one of the most fun things I did was to create stories in my head in English. I'd make up little scenarios or dialogues, kind of like daydreaming, but in English.
That's such a creative way to practice. It's like you're combining imagination with language learning. And because it's something you enjoy, it doesn't feel like work. It's more like playing with the language.
Exactly. And the best part is, you can do it anywhere, anytime. Whether I was on a walk, waiting in line, or even just relaxing at home, I could create these little stories. It helped me think in English more naturally and also sparked my creativity.
That's awesome. I think it also helps to remember that learning a language is a long term process, so it's important to find ways to keep it enjoyable. If it feels like a burden, it's going to be hard to stay consistent.
Definitely. And I think another aspect of consistency is accountability. For me, sharing my goals with a friend or even just writing them down helped keep me on track. When I told someone about my goal to think in English for 10 minutes a day, it made me feel more committed to actually doing it.
That's a great point. Accountability can really make a difference. I used to keep a journal in English and I'd write about my day or my thoughts. It wasn't just a way to practice writing, it was also a way to hold myself accountable. I knew that if I skipped a day, I'd see it in my journal, and that motivated me to stay consistent.
Journaling is such a great idea. It's a way to track your progress and see how far you've come. Plus, it gives you a space to reflect on your thoughts and experiences in English, which deepens your connection to the language.
Exactly. And over time, it becomes more than just a practice tool, it becomes a part of your life. I think that's one of the keys to thinking in English consistently, making it a natural part of your daily routine, rather than something you have to consciously think about all the time.
Absolutely. It's about integrating English into your life in a way that feels organic. And as you do that, you'll find that thinking in English becomes more and more natural. It won't be something you have to force, it'll just happen.
Yes, and that's when you really start to see the benefits, not just in your language skills, but in your confidence and comfort with the language. It's like the pieces start to fall into place, and you realize that you're not just learning English, you're living it.
That's such a powerful realization. When you start living the language, it stops being just a skill and becomes a part of who you are. And I think that's what makes all the effort worth it. You're not just learning words and grammar, you're expanding your ability to think, express, and connect with others in a whole new way.
Absolutely, it's a journey of growth, not just in language, but in how you see the world and communicate with it. And I think that's why it's so important to be kind to yourself along the way. It's easy to get frustrated or feel like you're not progressing fast enough, but every step forward, no matter how small, is progress.
That's so true. And I think it's important to remember that progress isn't always linear. There will be ups and downs, days when everything clicks, and days when it feels like nothing is working. But that's all part of the process. The key is to keep going and to celebrate the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. It's about embracing the journey and finding joy in the process. And I think that's something we can all take away from this conversation. Learning to think in English is a journey that takes time, patience, and consistency, but it's also an incredibly rewarding experience.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, we hope you're feeling inspired to keep going on your own journey. Remember, it's okay to take things one step at a time, and it's okay to enjoy the process. Thinking in English is a skill that will grow with you as long as you nurture it.